Neither the dire warnings recently issued by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, nor the decades-long efforts of environmentalists have managed to put a fire in the belly of this country to take action on climate change. Why not? Graham Saul is the Executive Director of Nature Canada and a Metcalf Innovation Fellow, and his research shows it might have to do with how the story of climate change gets told. And he joins us now to explain. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, the IPCC, as it's called, has issued a new report, so let's start there. What's the big takeaway from this newest report?
Well, the takeaway is that the world is quickly running out of time in terms of holding climate change to even moderate levels, and that we have a decade to take action if we want to meet our basic goals.
That sounds serious and would suggest that urgent action is needed. Do you see urgent action being taken?
I don't know, the news just keeps piling up. Just yesterday, there was another report that showed that the Earth's oceans are warming faster than we thought they were going to, and that might mean that even some of the more dire predictions are happening more quickly than expected. I see every day, it feels like you open up another report on the news and you hear, just the other day there was another one that said that since 1970, global wildlife has declined by 60%, which is a mind-blowing biodiversity crisis that we're facing. And yet we seem to still be electing governments that tear down even the modest progress that previous governments have made. And it seems in some ways like we're sleepwalking through this problem, even though the science couldn't be clearer.
Why do you think?
I think on the one hand, there's a bit of a boiling frog going on in the sense that we are gradually getting more and more used to the bad news. I think that a lot of people haven't done a good enough job of trying to get their head around the scale of the problem. And I think to some degree, the environmental community hasn't told a story that helps people understand the multiple ways in which humanity is undermining the broader life support systems of the planet.
I'm going to get to that in a second, the way that the story could be told better. But I have heard you describe the lack of interest that we apparently have in doing anything about climate change as an ethical fog. What does that mean?
Well, I think that every social movement from the past, whether it was the abolitionist movement against slavery or the women's movement or the great anti-colonial struggles around the Second World War, at the time when those movements are reaching breakthrough moments, society is shrouded by a kind of ethical fog. And what I mean by that is that even relatively well-intentioned people end up discussing deeply ethical issues in polite, almost technical fashion, rather than acknowledging the broader injustices that are unfolding around them. So, for instance, if you take the anti-slavery movement in the 1800s, people had polite conversations about whether or not a given country could afford to end slavery economically. There was a time when a member of parliament could stand up in the House of Commons and, without bringing himself into any disrepute, could essentially say, if Britain abolishes slavery, the French are just going to pick up the business. And so it's sort of like all of society gets shrouded by a kind of ethical fog. And abolitionists or environmentalists or women's rights activists or people involved in any social movement need to find ways to drag society as a whole out of that ethical fog and get them to take a better look at the actual implications of the decisions they are making and the very real ethical and implications of the decisions that society is taking.
In which case, if we can extend the metaphor, in the British Parliament, a guy named William Wilberforce came along, and suddenly he changed the nature of the way people thought about this. And then it was impossible to defend slavery in any way, shape, or form. Who's William Wilberforce going to be today as it relates to climate change?
I don't know. I mean, one of the arguments I would make is that we have a tendency to focus on iconic leaders in any great social movement like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi. But in fact, a great social movement takes all kinds, that it involves a wide range of people working in their own ways in a very messy way. I think we, at our peril, wait for a Wilberforce within the broader environmental crisis, because really it's the everyday folks and the activists and the scholars and the academics and the journalists and the politicians that are waking up every day and doing their own little bit to move us in the right direction that ultimately makes for a powerful social movement. But at the same time, there's no question that we need more leadership. In the Canadian context, from an executive perspective, from the perspective of people that are actually leading governments, where you see it coming from most right now is Indigenous leadership. They're really the only aspects of the First Nation and Indigenous community, really the only area of government or the only area of leadership where we are seeing people talk about the issues with the kind of moral and ethical clarity that we actually need to find a way to get through to people.
Well, it's not surprising in some ways, right? Stewards of the land for 10,000 years.
Right.
Makes some sense. I want to pick up on the last thing you said a couple of answers ago, which is we somehow have to tell, environmentalists have to tell the story differently from the way it's been told in order to engage people better. And to that end, you went out and interviewed more than 100 leading environmentalists and asked them a pretty simple question. What are we fighting for? Why that question?
So I come at this from two approaches. One is that I've been involved in environmental issues for over 20 years, and I've had the opportunity to work on a wide range of issues and with many of Canada's best environmental activists. I've also always been interested in history's great social movements, the epic struggles that redefine how people relate to each other, such as the civil rights movement and the anti-slavery movement and the anti-colonial movements around the Second World War. And as I looked more and more into some of those previous movements, I began to realize that one of the lessons you can draw from them is that great social movements use powerful words to sum up their ultimate goals. Words like equality, liberty, independence, freedom.
I got them here.
And these...
Can I give you the list?
Sure.
Okay. Here. Survival, sustainability, justice, conservation, human health. These were the answers you got back. What are we fighting for? Human rights, protection, preservation, balance, life, world safety, species rights, climate justice, green energy, greenhouse gas reduction, cultural change, species preservation, social justice. Is there a theme running through all of these?
You know, so when I took the time to interview 116 leading environmentalists and ask them the question, what are environmentalists fighting for, as opposed to those previous social movements where there was a relatively small collection of words that people could galvanize themselves around, what I found was the wide diversity of answers that you've just read. And I come to the conclusion that the environmentalists really don't have a clear and commonly used expression to sum up the ultimate goal of the environmental movement. It doesn't exist. But I do think that we have a common problem, and I do think we have a common solution that we have to find a way to better explain to people, because right now, when I look out on what's happening in the world, I feel like the dots are not being connected.
The three most frequently mentioned goals in your research that were evinced were 22% of respondents saying survival, 14% sustainability, 9% justice.
Yeah.
What do you infer from those answers?
So in the case of survival, I was surprised to hear that survival, almost 1 in 5 people said survival, because it hadn't really come up in my more ad hoc conversations. I think the reality is that many people are looking at the environmental crisis as a matter of survival, and there's a good reason to do so. If the problems we're facing today are left unchecked, we're looking at a scenario that will affect the lives of billions of people and threaten the very existence of hundreds of thousands of species. So there's a case to be made for putting it in those kinds of stark terms. And survival is a term that people can kind of understand because we've been trying to survive for thousands of years. But at the same time, it's also a very negative word. It raises the specter of an environmental community that traffics in catastrophe. And it doesn't really inspire the kind of hope that words like freedom and equality and independence do.
There is something about being able to put what you stand for on a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
Make America great again. Everybody knows what that means. Whether you like it or you don't like it, everybody knows what it means. You can't really do this with climate change, can you? Or you haven't been able to figure it out yet?
You can't do it with climate change, but at the end of the day, climate change is only one component of a broader environmental crisis. What we find ourselves, when we look at the broad range of challenges that we're facing, toxic contamination, habitat destruction, mass extinction, ocean acidification, and climate change, what we see is that there is, in fact, a common denominator that runs across those issues. And in the simplest sense, it's the fact that humanity is destroying the life support systems of the planet. And in many ways, for the first time, we're now in a position to truly understand the planet in terms of its holistic systems. When I was born, for instance, in 1971, the world didn't have a proper picture of the entire planet Earth. right? In 1961, there were only 6 satellites orbiting the planet. And since then, we put up 7,000 satellites, over 1,000 of which are still functioning. So in a very real way, over the course of the past 50 years, the world has woken up and is able to imagine the planet and see the planet and the full life support systems of the planet as an integrated way. And in the process, as we've looked at this myriad of problems, we've been forced to come to the conclusion that what they have in common is that humanity is destroying the life support systems of the planet. And that's a terrifying idea, but it's also an idea that sums up the disparate parts of the environmental movement. And at the end of the day, climate change is just one symptom of a broader problem with relation to planetary health.
Here's a quote we got. We got this from you. This is by an anonymous politician who said, "The average person thinks the environmental movement is about recycling more. The average person doesn't see the world in terms of radical transformation. They are more instrumentalists, and so the radical terms don't resonate with the average incrementalist." How do you respond to that?
Well, I think you're right that when you ask people what the solution to climate change is these days, one of the top answers will still be more recycling, because that's kind of the default thing that people know about.
And it's easy to do.
And it's easy to do, and it's something that we've been talking to them about for a very long time. At the same time, I mean, on the one hand, I agree that we need words and expressions that convey hope and inspire people to take action. But I also think there's something to be said for talking about the very real dangers that we have right now. I mean, in the past, in past social movements, it wasn't just people, for instance, like to say that Martin Luther King didn't say, "I have a nightmare." He said, "I have a dream." But the reality is that Martin Luther King spent a lot of time talking about the nightmare that was segregation in the South. And "I Have a Dream" was one part of that story. And so we need to find a way to really shake the consciousness of people, and talking honestly about the scale of the problem is one thing, but also putting forward a meaningful and inspiring vision is also another dimension of the challenge.
Is it possible, Graham, that people, just as they lead their daily lives, don't feel that they are, through everyday actions, doing anything that is particularly harmful to the planet?
Sometimes I describe the environmental crisis as death by 1,000 cuts. And that's because we go about our daily lives and we don't realize the way in which we're contributing to small problems that ultimately add up.
For example?
For example, our use of fossil fuels, our waste habits, the chemicals that we put into the environment. But at the end of the day, we have a broader problem. And people need to understand that that broader problem is what we're ultimately going to solve. And we're not going to solve it just through individual actions. We need to take a look at the world in its totality and insist that our governments take the kind of action that they need to take. And we're going to have to talk to Canadians and people around the world about the broader message and about what it means to demand political leadership from your decision makers, because this is a collective action problem, and we're only going to ultimately solve it with collective solutions and government leadership.
I'm going to go out on a bit of a tangent here, admittedly, but I know every time we do this subject on this program, there is a viewer, and he sends us incredibly lengthy emails, multiple, on how we're missing the boat here. He doesn't believe climate change is happening. He thinks that he thinks that our bringing you on today to talk about this is just more propaganda. And, you know, I try to be polite in responding to his emails when he does email in, and as do other people here on the program. But I don't know that we're convincing him that there's a real problem, and he certainly does not appear to be for turning. What do we do about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to convince him. Like, if he were a scientist and you were to bring 1,000 scientists in the room, there would be 3 of him and 997 others that had an opinion that were saying that we have a serious problem on our hands.
And I've mentioned that to him, and he says, "You've all drunk the Kool-Aid, and I'm the one dealing with empirically provable facts."
At some stage, I think we have to accept that there's a difference between responding to the crisis in the short and immediate term and convincing everyone at a very much deeper level. It's the difference between taking action to eliminate laws that discriminate against people and removing the stain of racism from people's hearts. That at the end of the day, there are a lot of people in society who are clinging to an idea based on a set of convictions and beliefs that are really not borne out in any way, shape, or form from what the world's best scientists are consistently telling us. That doesn't mean that a critical mass of people can't come together around the reality of what the science is telling us and move things forward. I think we do have to find ways to talk to people who don't spend much time thinking about these issues, but I'm not sure our biggest problem is convincing that person, because I'm not sure that person is ever going to be convinced.
No, he won't be, and he takes up a great deal of our bandwidth here in dealing with him because we feel an obligation to respond. But could it also be that when you and other environmentalists say, we are facing the prospect of a 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit rise in temperatures permanently, and people think to themselves, that's just not very much.
Yeah.
How do you get people sort of alarmed about that?
Well, I mean, I think, like I was saying earlier, what we need to do is we need to move beyond simply talking about the science, and we need to talk about the values that underlie the issue. And we need to find ways to talk about them in ways that trigger the emotions and the ethical implications and values of the people that we're speaking to. That at the end of the day, we've made a lot of mistakes around talking about the environmental crisis from a technical perspective. You know, we used to talk a lot during Kyoto about we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% below 1990 levels by 2020. But who talks that way?
Exactly.
Right? You don't say,
No
I
one knows
want to
what that
be
means.
I want to be 25% lighter than I was in 2010 by 2018. You say I want to lose 30 pounds. So on the one hand, we get trapped in some of this scientific discourse and we fail to talk about the immediate implications. But on the other hand, we just have to find easier and clearer ways to not just talk about the problem, but also to inspire people about the solutions.
Well, here's very clear talking from you. And Sheldon, let's bring this graphic up here. A generation is being born, you tell us in your report, a generation is being born that looks at the environmental crisis not just as a complicated regulatory and legislative problem, but as an ethical issue that reflects our commitment or lack thereof to address questions of environmental justice, intergenerational justice, and interspecies justice. This sounds like you want a pretty top-to-bottom revolution.
Well, there's no question that the moment we're in is ultimately revolutionary, right? The world as we know it has fundamentally changed. We've gone from a planet that historically humanity was having impacts at a very local level to a situation where we're literally affecting the entire world at the same time through things like climate change. And in the process, we've raised some very important moral and ethical questions. Like, for instance, climate change is a good example. Climate change is ultimately being fueled by a relatively wealthy and small percentage of humanity. And yet it is the poorest and most impoverished people in the world who are going to suffer the first and worst. In other words, those least responsible for the problem are going to be most damaged by it. That raises serious questions of global environmental justice. We know as well that if we fail to take action today to address problems, it's our children and grandchildren that are going to have to deal with those problems. And I would argue that the decisions we make today, knowing that that's going to happen, have profound ethical implications from an intergenerational justice perspective that humanity hasn't really come to terms with.
Can you also see why people who might be leading, quote unquote, their normal daily lives here in the province of Ontario might not be too alarmed about the notion that in 10 or 20 years' time, people who live in the South Pacific are going to have their islands overrun by rising oceans?
Yeah, I don't think, though, we're just talking about people in faraway countries. I think the reality is that climate change is happening now. We see it around us. We're seeing the worst forest fires in the history of the country. We're seeing flash flooding like we've never seen before. We're seeing the movement of certain kinds of disease, like Lyme disease, that's coming in. This is very real. And at the same time, any generation during moments when great injustices were unfolding around them would have preferred to just not have to deal with those problems. It wasn't like everyone woke up every morning within the context of when women's rights were being systematically denied on a grand scale, or within the context of the United States prior to the civil rights movement, and wanted to dive in to all of those details. But that doesn't mean that we can turn our back on them. We're going to have to come to terms with these problems one way or another. And the most responsible and, in fact, ethical thing to do is to do it sooner rather than later.
We're down to our last few minutes here, and I wonder if you're up for a very weird question.
Sure.
Given that where we're at today is a bit of a logical extension from the Industrial Revolution that happened 100 years ago. Would it have been better had that Industrial Revolution never taken place?
I like to say that we don't have an insulation problem, we have an asbestos problem. We didn't have a refrigeration problem, we had a CFC problem with relation to the ozone layer. And we don't have a energy problem, we have a fossil fuel problem with relation to climate change. And there's no question that fossil fuels were an amazing source of energy that were capable of unleashing all kinds of productivity that we didn't realize that we were going to be able to unleash. But the time has come to put those resources to bed. The time has come to realize that, like asbestos or like CFCs, or that burning oil, coal, and gas is killing people and driving species to extinction. And the reality is that we do have alternatives, and many countries are doing far more than we are. And so at the end of the day, I don't want the progress that has been made over the past 50 to 75 years in terms of human lifespans or nutrition or education to be swept away. I just want us to take responsibility for our actions and move swiftly to deal with the fact that we're unleashing toxins into the atmosphere that are life and death consequences for billions of people and hundreds of thousands of species.
But if we're prepared to acknowledge that we want all of the advancements that come with industrialization, is this not a kind of a necessary byproduct of all of that?
I don't think that humanity has to be essentially cancerous in terms of its relationship with the broader natural world. I don't think we inevitably need to find ourselves in a situation where we are undermining the life support systems of the planet. I think that humanity is an amazing species. I think we are a social species, one that's just as capable of acts of love and compassion as we are hate and indifference. And we have serious problems in front of us from an environmental perspective, and they have serious consequences, but there's nothing preventing us other than the movement that we need to build that can preventing us from bringing all this together and solving these problems. These are solvable problems.
In which case, let's finish up on this. Do you think people would be more receptive to the message if it were presented in less than a woe is us, we are bad, we are killing this planet, everything we do during our regular living days is ruining this planet, and were replaced with a more pragmatic acceptance of the fact that climate change was going to happen if we agree that people need to be fed, they need to be housed, we need to be mobile, we need to be free? Can we take that latter approach and have the improvements you want to see?
No, I don't think the problem is lack of or too much pragmatism. In fact, if anything, pragmatism is also used for an excuse for the status quo. And I do think that there's an argument to be made that we can't just always keep it in the negative. We can't always be talking about issues from a doom and gloom perspective. And let's be honest, environmentalists don't do hope very well. We traffic mainly in fear, if we're going to be honest with ourselves. So I don't think the question is embracing a pragmatism, because our pragmatism is what got us into this problem in the first place in terms of not being willing to acknowledge the broader consequences of our action. I think what we do need to do, though, is find ways to talk about this in hopeful and inspiring terms. You know, some people look at past social movements and they wish they could have been part of those breakthrough moments in human history. I look at the moment that we're in right now, and I feel like I have the opportunity to be part of one of the most hopeful and amazing things that has ever happened in the history of the human race. And that's humanity coming to terms with the planet and becoming a healing and restorative force in the world. And I think that's ultimately a more exciting and compelling way to talk about the problem than worrying about or then giving up on the fact that we're not going to be able to do as much as we'd like around climate change.
You have a dream. Yes, you do. That's Graham Saul. He's Executive Director of Nature Canada and a Metcalf Innovation Fellow, and we're so grateful to you for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Graham.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.